When Russia recently used the Oreshnik missile, it triggered a wave of headlines about hypersonic weapons, undetectable missiles, and new levels of escalation. Oreshnik has become a symbol of speed, power, and political messaging. But there is a weapon in the Russian arsenal that is talked about much less, and yet from a military perspective, it is much more interesting. Not because it is faster, but because of how it flies. It's called Avangard. It's not a conventional missile or a typical hypersonic missile. It's a hypersonic glide vehicle, a system designed to disrupt the very logic of air and missile defense. In this video, we'll take a factual and unemotional look at Avangard. We'll explain what it actually is, why it's talked about as a breakthrough weapon, what its real limitations are, and why Avangard, more than Oreshnik, better shows where the strategic thinking of great powers is heading. Why is Avangard less discussed but more important? If we compare how often Oreshnik appears in the media and how rarely Avangard is mentioned, it might seem paradoxical. While Oreshnik is used demonstratively and its deployment is accompanied by statements and headlines, Avangard mostly remains out of the public eye. The reason is simple. Oreshnik is a weapon that also has a political and psychological function. It is intended to send signals toward the West, to Ukraine, and to the domestic audience. Its use is meant to be visible, readable, and interpretable. Avangard works the opposite way. It doesn't belong to the realm of tactics or media messaging. It belongs purely to the strategic level. It's a system that doesn't show itself on the battlefield and isn't used to demonstrate power in an ongoing conflict. Its role is different: to exist in the background as a factor that changes calculations even before any conflict occurs. That's why Avangard gets less attention. The less information is publicly available, the more room there is for uncertainty. And in strategic deterrence, uncertainty often carries more weight than open threats or visible tests. Avangard is not a weapon meant for everyday use. It's linked to strategic carriers, meant for a different scenario, and follows nuclear deterrence logic. That's a key difference from the systems used in actual combat. To understand why Avangard has such a specific status, we now need to look at a fundamental question. What exactly is Avangard? Why isn't it considered a traditional missile? What is Avangard? To understand what makes Avangard special, we first need to clarify one thing. Avangard isn't a traditional missile. It's a warhead, a hypersonic glider, which doesn't launch on its own, but is carried into flight by a ballistic carrier missile. This carrier missile handles the first phase of the flight. It gets Avangard to a high altitude and the necessary speed. But at this point, their roles diverge. While a typical ballistic missile follows a predictable path, Avangard separates and, importantly, behaves differently. Rather than a steep descent, it enters the upper atmosphere and starts to glide, not passively but actively. It uses a combination of extreme speed and aerodynamic shape to move both horizontally and vertically, change its flight direction, and stay in the atmosphere much longer than would be possible with a conventional ballistic warhead. This is where the fundamental difference arises. Avangard does not create a predictable arc that can be precisely calculated in advance. Its trajectory evolves during flight. This means that early warning systems may be able to detect the launch of the carrier rocket, but they cannot say with certainty exactly where Avangard will ultimately strike its target. The hypersonic glider merges features from two worlds. It has a speed typical of ballistic systems, but behaves in a way that resembles controlled flight in the atmosphere. And it is precisely this combination that is the reason why Avangard does not fit into the traditional categories of air defense or missile defense. Simply put, while missiles are designed to follow a certain trajectory after launch, Avangard is designed to constantly change its trajectory during flight. And the way Avangard flies and maneuvers in the atmosphere will lead us to the core of the whole issue in the next part. Why is such a system so much harder for defense to predict than anything that has been considered so far? How does Avangard fly, and why is it so hard to predict? You can see the basic technical parameters on the screen now, but with Avangard, the principles of flight are more important than the numbers. When people call Avangard highly problematic for defense, it's about more than just its speed. The key is the way it flies and how it disrupts the basic assumptions on which existing defense systems are built. A classic ballistic missile maintains a stable trajectory once the warhead separates. Despite its speed, its path can be mathematically modeled. Defense works with probabilities, but it has a framework in which the target will move. Avangard disrupts this framework. After entering the atmosphere, it doesn't follow one path but actively maneuvers. It changes its flight altitude, adjusts direction, and works with speed so that its trajectory cannot be clearly predicted in advance. This means that the calculations that work for ballistic targets have to be repeatedly recalculated during the flight, often with incomplete data. Another issue is Avangard's operating altitude. It's not even high up in the exoatmospheric phase, where anti-missile systems designed to intercept ballistic warheads operate. It's not as low as a typical cruise missile. It operates in an area where defense layers overlap only partially, creating a difficult situation for defense. Early warning systems know that something has been launched. Radars can detect the target. However, the problem is not that they can't see it, but that they can't say with enough certainty where it's heading and how it will behave in a few dozen seconds. This is where the difference between Avangard and other hypersonic weapons becomes apparent. Hypersonic missiles can maneuver, but their flight is tied to the engine, aerodynamics, and a specific profile. Avangard doesn't have an engine in the traditional sense of the word. It glides. And that gives it freedom of movement, which is extremely difficult for defensive algorithms to process. However, that doesn't automatically mean that Avangard is magically invisible or completely out of reach of defenses. It means that defenses have significantly less time, less certainty, and more variables than they were historically designed for. And this is where we come to another key question that not only analysts but also military planners are asking themselves. Does this mean Avangard can't be intercepted? Or is it more complex? Is Avangard truly impossible to intercept? When discussing Avangard, impossible to intercept is mentioned quickly. It's a strong term that works well in headlines, but in reality, it needs to be used carefully. It's more accurate to say that Avangard is extremely difficult to intercept. It's not impossible to intercept. The difference between these terms is fundamental. It's not that the defense has no answer, but rather that existing systems were designed for a different type of threat. Missile defense has historically been optimized to intercept ballistic targets. They fly along a predictable trajectory, at high altitudes and with a relatively stable profile. However, Avangard operates differently and in a different environment. It moves through the atmosphere, rapidly changing altitude and direction. This means the defense has much less time to assess and less certainty in calculating the interception point. However, we must also consider the other side of the coin. Avangard is not invisible. The rocket launch is detectable and the glider can be tracked in flight by radar and sensors. So the problem isn't that the defense can't see anything, but that the information comes too late and with a high degree of uncertainty. In practice, this means that even if there were theoretically means to intercept such a target, their successful deployment would require extremely precise coordination, very rapid decision-making, and ideal conditions. That's a combination that can't be guaranteed in real scenarios. That's why Avangard pushes the boundaries not by making defense useless, but by increasing the risk of failure. It pushes the defense to its limits and reduces the time politicians and military commanders have to make decisions with major consequences. And this is where it becomes clear that the real problem with Avangard doesn't just lie in the technology. It's about how dramatically it changes psychology, reactions, and decision-making. This naturally brings us to the next part, to the question of the real limits of Avangard and why it is not a weapon that can be deployed on a massive scale. Limits of Avangard. Why it is not a weapon for waging war. In all the debates about Avangard, it's important to also mention what this system cannot do and why it cannot be seen as a universal or mass deployable weapon. Avangard isn't meant for regular deployment. It's not a system designed for repeated strikes in an ongoing conflict. Its place is completely different, on a strategic level, where a small number of extremely powerful means are used. One of the main limitations is the infrastructure itself. Avangard is tied to strategic carriers, that is, to large ballistic missiles. They are not flexible, they are not cheap, and they are not intended for rapid deployment or improvised use. Deploying such a system is costly and politically significant. Another limitation is quantity. There is no public evidence that Russia possesses a large number of operational Avangards. On the contrary, everything suggests that it is a limited number of units intended for specific scenarios, not for widespread use. The question of the warhead is also important. Avangard is primarily associated with nuclear deterrence. That means its use automatically moves the situation into a very different category than conventional strikes. It's not a tool for waging war in the classic sense, but a tool for influencing decisions even before a war would occur. These very limits show that Avangard cannot be understood as a weapon of victory. It's not a system that would decide conflicts on its own or replace other types of military capabilities. It's a highly specialized tool that only works in combination with a broader strategy, and that's where its true significance lies. Avangard is not a response to current battles. It's an answer to the question of how great powers set boundaries for each other that should not be crossed. That naturally brings us to the bigger picture. If Avangard is not an isolated solution but part of strategic thinking, what does that mean in the context of the global power race, and why does this system fit into the broader trend we're seeing today in Russia, China, and the United States? Avangard in the power race: Russia, China, United States of America. Avangard is not an isolated project. It reflects a broader trend of major powers addressing one key question: how to maintain deterrence in an environment where sensors, accuracy, and missile defense are improving. For Russia, Avangard has a clear function. It is a response to long-term defense development, especially in the United States. It's not an attempt to gain the ability to wage war in a different way, but an effort to maintain the credibility of a second strike. In other words, to maintain the certainty that strategic forces will function even if the opponent's defense improves significantly. China approaches the same issue differently. Its hypersonic projects are more regional in nature and are focused on the area of East Asia and the Pacific. In the Chinese perspective, hypersonic gliders are primarily used to complicate the enemy's defense near China's borders and to strengthen regional deterrence, not for global power projection. The United States, however, has prioritized accuracy, sensors, and defense over quickly deploying hypersonic gliders. This approach has only recently started to change. Today, American programs seek a more balanced response. It's not about competing in numbers, but about the ability to understand the threat and create effective countermeasures against it. From this perspective, Avangard doesn't seem like the start of an uncontrollable race, but rather as one link in a broader chain of responses. Every great power is solving the same equation, just with different priorities, different geographic focus, and a different political context. This also explains why hypersonic weapons are not becoming a mass tool. They are expensive, technologically demanding, and closely tied to strategic doctrines. Their significance does not lie in numbers, but in how they influence the thinking of the other side. And this is where the circle closes. Avangard is not just a Russian weapon. It is part of a global dynamic in which the way great powers think about security, defense, and escalation is changing. That brings us to the final question. What does avant-garde actually mean in this context? And why is it important to understand it correctly? What is avant-garde and what isn't it? In the end, it's important to return to the essentials. Avant-garde is not a miraculous superweapon that changes the rules of war overnight. It's not a tool meant for mass deployment or for waging conflicts in the traditional sense of the word. At the same time, it's not an overrated myth either. Avangard is a real, operational system that represents a qualitative change in the way strategic deterrence is considered. It's not because of a single technical parameter, but because of the combination of speed, maneuverability, and unpredictability. Its real significance doesn't lie in how many targets it can hit, but in how it influences decision-making. It reduces reaction time, adds uncertainty, and complicates calculations for current defense systems. All of this happens even before it would actually be used. Avangard thus fits into the broader picture of a world where technological progress is reflected not only on the battlefield, but also in psychology and strategy. It changes the way great powers think about risk, escalation, and the boundaries that should not be crossed. So when we compare Avangard with other systems like Oreshnik, the difference is not about which one is stronger. The difference is in their role. While Oreshnik works as a visible signal, Avangard operates more quietly and in the background. And that's where its strength lies. Avangard doesn't change wars. However, it alters the environment where decisions are made. That's why understanding it without emotions, shortcuts, or oversimplifications is important.
If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming content. You can also support my work with a thank you. And if you want to get the video to more people, click on praise. I appreciate it.